I stayed at my first job at a pretty small tech startup with around 10 people for around 8 months, where I worked as the sole React developer. And now I've been working at a tech company with around 3,000 employees for almost 2 years, where I've been working as mostly front end, but also some back end. Now it's time to reflect on the journey. I think this video will be particularly helpful for people who are in their early careers. Was becoming a software engineer what I expected it to be? When I was in college, I didn't get any internships, so I didn't really know what it would be like to work as a software engineer. What I expected was that I would probably be in this dark room coding alone where I wouldn't have to talk to other people. I mean, that's the introvert's dream. But the funny thing is, at my first job, that's kind of what it was like, because I worked at a really small startup. Everyone had their own rooms. I would say like 99% of the time I was alone just working on some feature that I needed to implement. Basically, my manager gives me a task to do, and once I figure out how to implement it, I use code to implement it. But the main problem was that at my first job, I just didn't really have much support because the startup was so small. And when I compare it to my current job, where I work in an open office and I'm forced to talk to a bunch of other people, and I feel like that's a better depiction of what a software engineer is. The kind of work that you do does vary based on your company, your team, your manager. But to put it very simply, like, what does a junior software engineer do? They create features and solve problems using code as a tool. How important is money? When most people think about software engineers, they think about the high salaries, like 6 figures right out of college. But when you're looking for your first job, you really don't have much leverage, so you don't really have much of a choice about how much you're going to make. While money is important, I don't think it's the sole factor of why you should choose a job offer. When I was looking for my first job, I rejected my first job offer. I made a video about this, but it was basically 30K in California, and I would have to work nights and weekends. I mean, at that point, it wasn't even really about the money. It was more about, oh, would this experience be good for me? Usually when the salary is pretty low, the quality of work will probably not be very good either. So I decided that I would be able to find a better job, and that was a pretty good decision. And when it came to my first job, I had 2 job offers. The first job offer was at a small insurance company. It was $80,000 in salary with pretty good benefits, 401k matching, and I would be able to live at home, so I wouldn't need to pay money on rent. However, the main issue was that it was a backend role using ASP.NET and C Sharp, and I had no experience with that because I just wanted to become a front-end developer. For my second job offer, it was at the small tech startup. It was $90,000 in salary with pretty bad benefits, no 401k matching, and I would need to move from Southern California to the Bay Area and pay Bay Area rent and food. But this job was in React, which is what I wanted to do, but I didn't realize until later that it was class-based components. So if I wanted to compare these 2 jobs, if I took the first job offer, I think I would have made around 30% more in the first job because I would be able to live at home and they had pretty good benefits. But I chose the small tech startup because I wanted to see what it's like to work at a tech startup in the Bay Area, and I also just really wanted to work with React. To me, the experience would be much more worth it than the money. And although I did quit my first job and move back home in 8 months, I don't regret my decision at all. I feel like I learned a lot about what not to look for in a company. So what I'm trying to say here is I don't think money should be your primary factor when you're choosing a job offer, but I know it's pretty hard to get a job right now, so you'll probably just take whatever you can get. How important is experience? In your early career, I feel like your experience is the most important. You want to be in an environment where you feel like you're actually learning and improving as a software engineer. Because once you built really good experience, you can make more money down the line because you'll have more leverage. So now I'm going to compare what it was like working at my first company compared to my current company. So like I said earlier, at my first company, I was mostly working alone where I didn't really have much mentorship. There were also no code reviews or unit tests, so it made it really difficult to become better. You can imagine if I stayed here for a really long time, then my skills probably wouldn't be that good. Let's say I got promoted to mid-level at the startup. If I tried to switch to my current company, I would not be a mid-level at my current company. Titles aren't the same across different companies. I learned more in the first 2 months at my current company than I learned in my whole 8 months at the startup. And that's because the environment just had much higher standards. When I started working at my current company, I was surrounded by a bunch of senior engineers who used to work at some of the biggest tech companies. Now I can learn so much because I'm in an environment where my teammates actually care about my growth. So what I'm trying to say here is that I think the most important thing in your early career is to find an environment where you can learn and grow as a developer. And I know it's pretty hard to gauge from the interviews because every company is different and you don't really know what it's like to start working until you start working. So I think your environment is crucial in your learning and development. This is why people at the biggest tech companies are generally pretty good software engineers. It's because they're surrounded by so many other experienced software engineers that they can learn from. How difficult is working as a software engineer? So I would say definitely the work I do now at my current job is so much more difficult than my first job. And that's just because the quality and standards are a lot higher. As I started to gain more experience, I started to get more responsibilities. Some of the tasks that I work on are pretty complex. And I know I'm never alone because I could always ask my teammates for help. I think the hardest part about the job is the constant learning. When people talk about constant learning in software engineering, I thought it would be like, oh, you have to learn the latest technologies, you need to keep up to date. But that's actually not what it's like when you're working as a software engineer. Because you'll be working on an existing code base, you're not going to be learning the newest framework or technology. For example, at my first job, it was React, but it was class-based components. Before I started working, I only did functional components in my personal projects. And that's because that's a newer version of React. But when it comes to working at a company, they care about stability the most. So most of the time they'll be using an older version of a framework. So the constant learning would be like, oh, well, I worked in functional components before, but now I'm going to learn what it's like to work in class-based components. And to me, that's what constant learning as a software engineer means. You'll go into a code base, not really know how to do something, but you need to figure out how to do it. There's so many times where I've gone into other people's code base to try to figure out how to implement something. And you can imagine it gets pretty complex. When I was working on a pretty complex project, I started stressing a lot, and that's actually why I stopped posting on this channel for a few months. But now I kind of learned how to deal with the stress. You just need to communicate why things are going to take longer. A lot of the deadlines set are usually imposed by product managers. So even if you don't meet them, you just need to tell them why it's taking a lot longer, like if you run into any issues. So now I don't stress as much, and I feel like now that I've worked as a software engineer for a while, it's really helped me learn how to break down complex problems and communicate more efficiently. Do I still enjoy being a software engineer? I think for me, it's kind of a special case because I'm a complete introvert and I fit the stereotypical software engineer. I used to play a bunch of video games, so I'm used to sitting in front of the computer for long periods of time. But I do think it's one of the best jobs in terms of salary potential and work-life balance combo. When you compare it to other jobs like investment bankers, doctors, or lawyers, they have to go to school for so much longer than we do, and their work-life balance isn't that great. So I think I got really lucky that my dad chose computer science for me in college. I didn't know what major I wanted to do because I was too busy playing video games at the time. But do I see myself doing this for the rest of my life? Although I do like working as a software engineer, I can't imagine working until I'm like 50 or 60. I just think working in a 9 to 5 job, even if it's a software engineer, for like the rest of my life would be kind of depressing. So one of the reasons I started this YouTube channel was to be able to make money on the side while working, but also be able to help people by sharing my experiences. Early on in my career, I made a decision to not make coding my life. I think this is a pretty important decision to make because I started just trying new things outside of work. I could have been just working 24/7 trying to become the best software engineer I could be, and that's totally your decision to make. But because I made that decision, it kind of led me down this path where I'm now making some YouTube videos. What I'm trying to say is that working as a software engineer has been pretty life-changing for me, but I can't imagine doing it for the rest of my life because I want true freedom away from a 9 to 5 job eventually. How I'll get there, I'm not sure. I'm just kind of going with the flow right now and seeing where it takes me. But I do have a goal to eventually get into one of the biggest tech companies, not Amazon, before I eventually try to do things on my own.